probably expressed what her political ideology is, and that's okay. So that there's no better way to engage 100 of my new closest friends but to talk politics tonight. Even more so, it would be more appropriate for me to focus perhaps on our president. Jimmy Carter, of course, from 1980. Because it was Jimmy Carter, actually, in 1980, that you may or may not recall, who first was there as a huge advocate and developed this commission on insurance parity. It was the first time, really, that we started to have these conversations about mental health conditions, being medical illnesses. It was the first opportunity for us to be able to think about the brain as an organ. It was the first opportunity for conversations to take place in which the brain could compete against the heart and the pancreas. It was an opportunity to increase the discussion about the importance of integrated healthcare, the importance of medical care being on parity with other medical illnesses. And while it's somewhat ironic that the brain was the least understood organ, what we did discover, and what we have the opportunity to celebrate in regards to our awareness of this competitive spirit amongst our organs, is the fact that mental illness is absolutely no different than heart disease or diabetes or any other medical illness. And being able to embrace that understanding of this disability being absolutely no different is an absolute game changer in terms of what took place for the next 30 to 38 years. So with that discussion, and even though the commission was not successful at that time in being able to pass parity in regards to insurance, the conversation almost developed a hybrid discussion as a result of it. So as a result of that, you could see in like 1988, the Fair Housing Law had an amendment. Now we're celebrating 50 years of fair housing, which is incredible. But the disability component of fair housing was added. In 1990, the ADA came about, and in 1999, the Supreme Court ruling in regards to the Olmstead Act. If many of you have familiarity with that particular ruling, it was a ruling that suggested that individuals with mental health disabilities should be provided services in the least restrictive environment. The concept that maintaining and providing the services to individuals with serious mental illness can be done successfully outside of the psychiatric hospitals, and perhaps at even a lower cost. We found consistently, when you start to do comparisons in cost, when you start talking about return on investments, which is not the most important thing, but certainly one that is a major advocacy point if anyone wants to use that, you can find that typically, and we've done the studies at Pathways, that a cost of housing per day, Pathways and an organization like Brain Foundation, typically costs about $32 a day, compared to $37 a day at a shelter, $167 per day at a prison or jail, or $600 to $800 per day at a psychiatric hospitalization. Doesn't take a lot of mathematicians to figure out. That's a good investment in many, many ways. So after the Olmstead Act in 1999, moving forward, there were a number of other types of things that happened. In 2008, we actually did have the Insurance Parity Act that was passed. Jimmy Carter was elated. And then not too long after that, many of you are aware here locally that the Department of Justice ruling came about. Very similar theme of activity, right? Where the determination was that with individuals with disabilities, developmental disabilities, should be transitioned out of state hospitals and into the community in the least restrictive setting. And that also was a wonderful precursor to what was called the CCC+. Is anyone familiar with that term? One person in the back? It's the Commonwealth Coordinated Care Act here in Virginia. And what happened with the CCC+, which is just beginning to roll out into Virginia this year, is that it was the transition from a fee-for-service to a value-based form of providing services. So outcome-based, being able to make sure that the services that were provided can be measured and validated as effective. And so now in Virginia, as opposed to just having Magellan to triage and provide the Medicare complement services for individuals with disabilities, we now have what I call the big six. These are the Blues and Aetnas and Cignas, et cetera, that are all now providing these services for individuals that we have the privilege and pleasure of serving. And I guess you may, if you're a Virginian, paid a little bit of attention to Medicaid expansion that was just passed. Yeah. There's a couple of yays and there's a couple of nays. But with that, now we're going to be able to now serve over 400,000 additional individuals in the state of Virginia that otherwise would have been unserved. One of the exciting things that's going on about Medicaid that I'm hoping that the Bourdain Foundation and so many other nonprofits are able to move forward on is there is now a new pilot project. Actually, Pathways is going to launch a new pilot project for the state of Virginia. It's going to be called the Permanent Supportive Housing Medicaid Waiver. That's a fascinating idea because in Montgomery County, Maryland, PG County, they have these waiver programs where now these insurance companies are actually recognizing that if they're able to identify their high utilizers or users, those are the individuals that touch points in our community at a significant cost. So oftentimes, before we have the opportunity to provide services to an individual, that individual has been in emergency rooms, has been homeless, has been in psychiatric hospitals. And so the cost to the community of providing services is enormous. And so we're going to be launching a pilot this year that's going to have the insurance companies begin to recognize the value of housing in regards to recovery. Now, while integrated healthcare is the core in regards to the medical component of it, it's very important to recognize the significance of the social determinants of health in regards to an individual's recovery. You know so many of those social determinants in regards to individuals' education, vocational, health, food, etc. But the most significant social determinant of health in the recovery of individuals with serious mental illness is that of housing. And SAMHSA and NAMI and a host of others validate that the most effective form of housing is what the Bourdain Foundation is doing in helping an individual with SMI, serious mental illness, fully recover. That is permanent supportive housing, again, at a cost that's far less than the cost of doing business as we are traditionally doing business. It's very important to be able to pull our partners together and recognize this value of housing. It's also important to recognize that when we're providing these services, usually we're looking at 50 to 60% of the population having been homeless or chronically homeless. And the HUD's definition of chronic homeless is 4 times in the last 3 years or 1 year continuously. So individuals have been on the streets for many, many years. In our Florida offices, we're finding that because of the climate, people are homeless 12 to 15 years before they're finding housing. Here in this community, it's more so around 3 to 4 years before individuals are able to secure housing, and there's very limited resources that are dedicated to that cause. So it's incredibly important to recognize this incredibly valuable resource, the Bourdain Foundation that we have in our community, to think about the resources and the return on investment that we have by being able to continue to invest in a model slightly different but radical in regards to its founders' thoughts and being able to address these needs. And the other piece which is unique and highly supported in the literature base is the recognition and importance of developing tailored housing. Not everyone wants to live alone. Some people want to live in larger congregate environments. Some people, because of their illness, it's ill-advised to be able to be living in congregate environments. Trudy is creating homes for individuals. The Brain Foundation is creating a home. And perhaps, as you know, when you're looking at having individuals become internally motivated to take their medications, to be active participants in the community, to be constituents in our environment, they need to develop the relationships. One of the most important things in being human is having the capacity to interact, relate, and thrive from the relationships that we build at a very basic level. There's not a lot of psychobabble or a lot of literature that has to be able to validate what we know and experience every day. We're happier when we can share our lives with one another. And so developing that relationship, one person at a time, literally transforms lives. Literally transforms lives. When we're looking at the population that we're serving, keep in mind that 1 in every 5 individuals in the United States suffers from a serious mental illness. 1 in 25 individuals actually suffers from a mental illness. 1 in 25 suffers from a serious mental illness. And those are those thought and affective disorders such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD. Out of that number, 68% of that entire number has a physical condition or medical condition that traditionally manifests in 3 areas. There are a few, but the priorities are diabetes, hypertension. These are stress-related illnesses, by the way. Stress exacerbates these symptoms. And the other piece, which is interesting, is asthma. Because many of the individuals with substandard housing are exposed to toxins in our environment that we don't traditionally think about. Not to mention their exposure to the elements when they're unhoused. So it's very important to understand who we are as an individual. It's important to understand beyond those statistics that we oftentimes with these disabilities are major contributors to the lifestyles that we experience. If it's Van Gogh, Beethoven, Ernest Hemingway, Patty Duke, Robin Williams, the list, Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, the list goes on and on and on of individuals who suffered from mental illness. Some moved towards recovery. Some did not. You know, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the impact, I think, of the double suicides that took place in the last 72 hours. When I left home today, I walked through my dining room before I left the house. I was very proud of myself because I watch a lot of home and garden TV, so it really looks nice. My dining room is all laid out. It has the flatware and everything, and it's really nice. I like it. My garden, like 101. But it was interesting because I went over to the table and I raised one of the plates and it said, Kate Spade. 6 degrees, right? Kate Spade, I mean, an incredible woman, 55 years old, right? Suffered from depression. I understand there were some dynamics that took place in those last days that resulted in this incredible woman hanging herself and then sending a letter to her daughter, explaining that it wasn't her fault. That child will always wonder why. A suicide impacts just more than one person. And it also apparently had a note to say, ask daddy. Now, if you were that child, think about your impact in regards to your mother's suicide. One of the things that I think is so humbling to think about in regards to mental illness is but by the grace. Because at any given time, one significant trauma can place you in the position of the individuals that we serve. I'm a family member. I'm a family member with co-occurring disability. Many of you are family members. It's not just the individual that's fighting these demons that's impacted. It impacts entire family systems. It impacts your self-confidence. It impacts stigma. And for me, and for many years, it manifested in just pure ignorance and denial until I moved into this field for over 30 years now. It's a growing process, so it's never too late. And then Anthony Bourdain. This morning, I'm a psychotherapist, so I have a private practice, and I was seeing a couple people this morning, and I gained 6 degrees. I had a gentleman who came in for a co-occurring assessment, an ASAM assessment this morning, and he shared with me, he said, you know, Doc, he said, he was my idol. I said, Anthony Bourdain was your idol? He said, yeah, you don't understand. He says, you know, I don't know why, he was sharing, he was in college, he's a young college gentleman. He says, I just loved, he was so free and so cool and so healthy, and he loved life. I think that it's somewhat ironic also that if you've watched his show, the name of that show is Parts Unknown. And when we tie that back to the Brain Foundation, the parts that are unknown still remain the complexities of the brain. We know that oftentimes individuals that suffer from depression have a smaller hippocampus. We know that there's oftentimes a higher level of cortisol. We know the serotonin levels are depleted oftentimes. These are things that are low-hanging fruit for us to understand in depression. But what people oftentimes overthink when they think about depression is that it's perhaps, in many ways, one of the easiest illnesses to impact, because it requires us to have, as Trudy mentioned earlier about care. When she gave you the introduction today, she talked about care. Care engagement. If you see someone helpless and hopeless, ask them, how are you? How are you feeling? Don't hesitate if you're concerned about a loved one to ask them, are they concerned about killing themselves or harming themselves? You can apologize, make sure the person knows there's no judgment being rendered. But reach out and engage, because people are dying. One person dies by suicide every 16.5 minutes. 45,000 individuals last year died from suicide. Individuals in the United States tend to commit suicide more in the spring months, not winter, than any other month of the year. 20 veterans kill themselves a day. And you can impact change. My son's in the military, I call him. I'm kind of an overbearing mom. I'm like, hi, honey, how are you doing? Any new girlfriends? What's going on? How are you feeling? Are you lonely? Are you sad? Are you eating? Do you have friends? They're used to me by now, so they answer the questions just so I stop asking the questions. My daughter, when she was in college, began to isolate. Are you okay? Do you need something? Are you thinking about harming yourself? Can I get you help if you don't want to talk to me? There's a 1-800-SUICIDE number. If you see signs of someone slipping into a helpless, hopeless state, call someone. Don't sit by, because you can be that care agent that saves a life. And the good news is, if a person attempts suicide and you engage, 90% of those individuals that survive that suicide attempt move on to have healthy, happy, impactful, like Martin Luther King, lives that impact worlds and thought processes. It just takes being there. If you see something, say something to save a life. And that's really, in short, what the Brain Foundation is doing. They're developing relationships. They're creating informal family systems that change memories and lifetimes and legacies that are built. I'm going to share with you one example of an individual that recently impacted me. It was a person who had been on the streets for about 15 years, suffered from a myriad of illnesses. You can kind of write the script in regards to what the individual might have been challenged with. And as soon as they finally made it into housing, within 3 months they died. And my entire staff, they were mortified. This is down in their Florida office. And I walked in and reminded them of an incredible gift that was given to this individual of having dignity. And the opportunity that this man's children now had to read the story of their father who passed away in a home, and how that story resonates in terms of the downline of the legacy of this entire family. It's really important to be able to differentiate the illness from the individual. The person's not schizophrenic. They suffer from schizophrenia. The person isn't bipolar. The person didn't commit suicide. The person died from suicide. Sometimes it's the semantics, but the semantics sometimes help in terms of the understanding and what we are able to do in terms of the advocacy. I want to mention something about education and advocacy beyond these topics, and pardon me for staying on the topic of depression a bit longer than I would, but it's impacting us on a daily basis, and I couldn't not take the time to be able to discuss this evening. But I do want to talk to you about some things that are game changers here in Virginia. For instance, around the issues of advocacy, there are some things to look out for. For one, it's important to be able to put on your advocacy chart low-income tax credits, because for many nonprofit organizations that partner with developers, with the tax change, there's a disincentive now for many developers to look at low-income tax credits because they're already getting a tax credit on a raised rate. So it's important to take a look at that. Project-based vouchers. There are no project-based vouchers in Fairfax this current year. These are the types of subsidies that are so incredibly important in being able to create the balance sheet that allows for us to be able to continue developing these homes and sustaining these homes more long-term. Keep a lookout in terms of what's impacting the decisions with HUD around the continued or the continuation of CDBG, Community Development Block Grants, home grants, those dollars that are so essential in being able to develop housing long-term. Because even for a nonprofit that's able to purchase a home with no mortgage, there's still carrying costs on that home. You still have to escrow, there's still taxes, there's still utilities, and if you're charging 30% of your income, which may be anywhere between $0 and $150 from the individuals that we serve, it becomes imperative that you continue to recognize how important your financial investments are in a nonprofit organization like the Bourdain Foundation. Sustainable nonprofits diversify, but with the government, grants, foundations, oftentimes having to scale back for individuals who are now itemizing, no longer potentially being as motivated to give. It's even more important for you to recognize the importance of your role tonight and your importance in regards to your continued partnership with the Bourdain Foundation. And the other piece in terms of programs and policies to keep your eye out on is the program of Housing First. Housing, non-contingent upon services, giving